would like to begin by thanking Thomas and Martin and Nina and all the other people who helped in putting together this conference. And I want to thank you for inviting me to it. Because, you see, I have to make an admission at the very beginning. I am not a Kant scholar. I am not as much of a Kant scholar as David is. I am not even a buggy, flawed, partial simulation of a Kant scholar. I know, as you might expect, what Kant scholars do. I know what they are. And here we are in the golden age of Kant studies, and wonderful work is appearing about Kant. It's not just, it seems to me, one of the jewels of the history of philosophy, but one of the jewels of philosophy, period. But I don't do that sort of thing. 50 years or so ago, philosophers sometimes wandered into Kant's texts, scavenged selectively, and wrote articles about some particular concept or thesis or argument that caught their fancy. Jonathan Bennett and P.F. Strawson pioneered the genre, treating Kant as a contemporary and using him for their own philosophical purposes. Lesser folk followed suit. I was one of them, intrigued by some of Kant's ideas about mathematics, by his notion of the a priori, and by his suggestions about the unity of the sciences. Perhaps some of what resulted was useful even for real scholars. But whatever the merits of this genre, today you are fated to get more of the same. The target of my scavenging is a Kantian gestalt that I take not to have received its due. To my mind, the third formulation of the categorical imperative is the ugly duckling of Kant's three versions, slighted in favor of its apparently more attractive siblings. For naturalists like me, those more popular formulations are far less appealing. The first formulation offers a test for maxims that seems to invoke so inflated a notion of reason that the efforts of ordinary people to put it to work seemed doomed to go awry. The second can hardly fail to generate a warm glow, but like its cousin, the Christian second commandment, it seems woefully vague about how to handle the innumerable moral issues in which the needs and interests of different people are in tension. An uncharitable naturalist reading of these parts of Kant's moral theory might view him as retaining the structure of orthodox Christian ideas about morality. The principal occupant of the starry heavens gives way to an internal object of worship. We should love and revere divine reason and the moral law within. We should treat other human beings as children of reason, all of us siblings imbued with this transcendent capacity. But I think with the third formulation comes an exciting idea. Humanity comprises a political unit, a kingdom, or maybe a republic, in which we are all potential lawmakers. So my aim today is to take that thought seriously, to attend to various possibilities for interpreting it, and to try to find a home for it, not in some distant realm of reason, but in the everyday world. I'm looking then for a naturalized version of the third formulation. Although, as I've lamented, this particular part of the groundwork has excited less philosophical attention than other passages, it hasn't been entirely neglected. It has inspired one of the greatest moral philosophers, and to my mind, the greatest political philosopher of the last century. John Rawls's version of Kantian constructivism is, in my view, not only a major work of moral theory, but also deeply attuned to Kant's own development of the idea. That's controversial, as we found out yesterday, and I apologize if I'm making mistakes here. T.M. Scanlon moves a little further from Kant, but continues to maintain some distinctive themes, most notably in his emphasis on a notion of reason and of reasonableness that transcends history and social context. Paulina Kleingeld has explored the political dimensions of Kant's picture with great care and subtlety, and she offers the most lucid account of the third formulation of which I'm aware. But, scavenger that I am, I don't want to hew as closely to Kant as any of these authors. In the spirit that motivated Bennett and Strawson, I want to have a conversation with Kant about the character of this supposed Reich and of the way in which lawmaking occurs in it. The text serves me then as a springboard. What are the possibilities for those who want to leap? So I'm going to start not with the text of the groundwork, but with the kinds of political units with which we're familiar. As you all know, actual laws are made and enforced by a very small sample of those to whom they're intended to apply. Some historical states show the extreme version of this system. A single dictator has absolute power. He, it almost always is he, decides what's to be law, and the populace must conform. Democracies attempt to limit the power of the lawmakers by making them answerable to the rest of the citizens. Whether this succeeds in bringing the actual laws closer to those a majority of citizens would endorse is a complex issue. The deepest explorations in political theory expose reasons for skepticism. In actual political states, the identity of the lawmakers affects the character of the laws. It matters who governs. If we imagine different individuals or groups of individuals assuming power, we expect variation in the legal code. So a first question to ask about any society with a legal system, real or imagined, focuses on the lawgivers. Who are they? Call this the identity question. The second question concerns the ways in which laws constrict or enhance freedom. Naively, we might suppose lawmaking to be an activity in which the free decisions of the governors are made manifest, and law following to exhibit a curtailment of the freedom of the governed. Yet we should ask whether there are subtle ways in which all human freedom is limited. Even the least restricted dictator is, after all, born into a society with traditions and a culture from which he inevitably acquires his basic psychological capacities. His powers of reasoning, as well as his desires, are shaped from the time of his birth by the socialization he receives. Does there ever come a point at which he can extricate himself from this, becoming fully autonomous? That seems dubious. To be sure, people often repudiate aspects of the traditions in which they have been reared, but their reactions continue to be informed by desires and canons of decision-making that trace back through their personal histories. The dictator may well differ from those whom he commands in the extent of particular freedoms, but like the humblest citizen, he is constrained by the past. Nor is the predicament of the governed as dire as we might initially think. Given the desires their socialization has bred in them and the reasoning capacities they have acquired, the laws laid down by, let's say, a benevolent dictator may remove obstacles that would otherwise have prevented them from realizing their goals. Plato and Hobbes already envisaged the possibility. In Hobbes's charming metaphor, the laws are the hedgerows enabling people to travel along the highways without encumbrance. So we might ask, how free are particular groups? What kinds of freedoms and limitations on their freedom do they experience? Call this the autonomy question. There's another obvious feature of actual lawmaking. In all the political units about which we know, those who make the laws are parts of a continuing enterprise. They amend a pre-existing legal corpus. Presumably, there were once pioneers who started the enterprise from scratch, but we can only speculate about how they proceeded or about the conditions that were needed for them to lay the foundations of what later evolved. So, as we consider lawmaking, we should be clear about the task to be discharged. Are we imagining the law constructed in full from an original state in which it does not yet exist? Or are we supposing the lawmakers to engage in legal change, revising a body of statutes in an attempt to make progress? Call this the foundations question. To summarize, actual lawmaking features a tiny sample of lawmakers whose decisions are far from invariant under substitution. They and those they govern are checked in varying and significant ways. They work with a legal corpus inherited from the past, trying by their own lights to improve it. Kant's vision of his realm of ends is rather different. Otherworldly, even. Let's begin with the identity question and ask if the Kantian Reich is a democracy or a dictatorship. Kant provides an intriguing answer to that question. It really doesn't matter. Each rational being could assume the role of dictator either for a day or for a lifetime. Whoever played the part, it would make no difference. Lawgivers are perfectly intersubstitutable. As I read the text of the groundwork, this provocative thesis contains an ambiguity. The obvious reading supposes complete unanimity on preference orderings. Suppose you and I are two perfectly rational beings. We enumerate a complete list of potential laws, either single propositions pertaining to a specific issue or an entire legal code. We then rank them. When they're compared, the ranked lists are identical. The less obvious interpretation imagines us approaching our task differently. Each draws up a list of the acceptable laws. We do so by explicitly considering ourselves as fellow citizens with other rational beings. We recognize differences among rational beings with respect to aspirations, desires, and life projects. The acceptable laws are those we take to be acceptable to all rational beings, whatever the character of their predilections. If we're correct, all rational beings will converge on the same acceptable set, even though the members of the set receive different rankings. A weaker kind of consensus would require only that among all rational beings, the acceptable sets have a non-empty intersection. Even though you find acceptable laws I could not tolerate, or vice versa, all is well, provided there's at least one candidate we can both live with. If what Kant proposes is the obvious interpretation, it's far from clear what the third formulation adds. The idea of our being fellow citizens with other people or other rational beings reduces to the thought of us as carbon copies of one another. The kingdom of ends becomes a monarchy or a democracy of clones. Rawls preserves this structure when he introduces a single deliberator behind the veil of ignorance. Human diversity gives way to Maximin reasoning with highly limited information. The messiness of democratic life is transformed to fully enlightened and therefore benevolent dictatorship. I want to view Kant as going one step further, allowing real differences in the legal choices to which different rational beings are inclined, but filtering those differences through reflection on the counterpart inclinations of other rational beings. Each lawmaker must consider or envisage the ways in which fellow citizens would assess the potential laws. The acceptable sets emerge from filtering according to what it would be reasonable for those citizens to demand. A transcendent, ahistorical conception of reason and of reasonableness generates laws that take account of what we owe to each other. As I read him, Scanlon articulates this strand in Kant's thinking. Deliberative democracy enters the picture, albeit still in a highly idealized form. Naturalizing Kant will require us to go further in this direction, moving away from the lone Kantian, Rawlsian, Scanlonian subject credited with authority about moral principles. We'll need to replace an abstract constraint imposed by reasonableness with a this-worldly conception of reasoning, an activity not restricted to the mind of the putative lawgiver, but carried on among fellow citizens whose perspectives diverge. Reasoning is what people do, not only in their heads, well or badly. And the history of logic and of other parts of philosophy and of legal theory shows the evolution of attempts to recognize what makes forms of reasoning better or worse. Out of this history come canons of reasoning, often hailed, dubiously I think, as a priori, to which Kantians and others want to add further forms worthy of a similar status. To follow the dictates of these forms of reason is allegedly to attain a form of freedom. Autonomy consists, at least etymologically, in giving laws to yourself through the exercise of reason. Yet what Kant or anyone else identifies as the constituents of pure reason is the outgrowth of a long enterprise of inquiry pursued by a species with particular capacities, and indeed by the different ancestral species from which Homo sapiens emerged under a variety of social conditions, all of this profoundly shaped by attempts to satisfy the most basic biological needs, as well as by the complex psychological and social conditions brought about by the historically contingent evolution of culture. What we properly accept as rules of reasoning in some particular domain, inquiry into nature, say, or theorem proving in mathematics, depends on the goals of investigation in that domain. These rules don't descend to human users from some methodological heaven. They are worked out by reflecting on successes and failures. Unfortunate outcomes of medical research teach us the importance of double-blind testing. Alleged theorems with counterexamples inspire a logical system in which the order of quantifiers can be distinguished. A corollary. The rules for moral inquiry are those that systematically explain the patterns of moral advances and moral regression. It is highly doubtful that Kant or anyone else can offer anything close to a complete system of those rules. These points have an important bearing on the autonomy question. To declare that we are free through our acts of self-legislation is only plausible if those acts are governed by appropriate standards for moral inquiry. Insofar as the first two formulations of the categorical imperative offer such standards, they fail to pick sides in the most obvious moral advances of the past 2 centuries. Abolitionists and slaveholders, feminists and male chauvinists, gay rights activists and homophobes can all defend the compatibility of their attitudes with the Kantian tests. It's simply a matter of introducing, as the historical protagonists actually did, a supposedly justified taxonomy for partitioning the appropriate population. Closing the debates requires a method for undermining some ways of drawing the distinctions, and that's something these accounts of reason don't supply. The third formulation, however, points in a more promising direction when it views human beings as fellow citizens. If we conceive the polity as a state in which the new generation of citizens is inevitably shaped by the institutions and cultural traditions that have been inherited from the past, their limited autonomy will consist in an ability to find their own direction for their lives and to receive the support they need in pursuing the goals they set for themselves. Instead of seeing them as coerced into particular pre-assigned roles, the processes through which they are socialized and educated should attend to the features they exhibit at each developmental stage. Think of socialization as a process in which a biological organism, a newborn member of Homo sapiens, grows into a person through a dialogue in which those who direct the growth are attentive to whatever inclinations they can discern. The degree to which choices are autonomous depends on the delicacy with which the educators listen, straining their senses to detect the individual qualities of the growing person. Fellow citizenship is, I suggest, grounded in an ideal of equality. Each of us is to be guided by the most delicate dialogue we can achieve. To the extent the ideal is realized, we approximate a concept of autonomy formulated by Mill in the approach he drew from von Humboldt and ultimately from Kant, the ability to choose one's own good and to pursue it in one's own way. As we shall see, this line of thought acknowledges the provisional nature of our moral investigations, recognizes the fragmentary and incomplete state of moral method, and uses a particular approach to democratic citizenship to construct the Kantian Reich. The lawgivers in that polity are by no means intersubstitutable. They are individuals with different proclivities and different aspirations. Their lawmaking cannot be an affair for any single member. It must be collective. Moreover, it must be pursued according to the distinctive character of fellow citizenship through a delicate dialogue with one another. Nor can the making of laws be viewed as the construction of an entire code, sufficient to resolve every issue, based on foundations that can be laid in advance. Many of the most eminent moral philosophers, from Bentham and Kant to Derek Parfit and Thomas Nagel, seem to have imagined a total moral system, just as daydreaming physicists envisage a final theory, a complete system of the world axiomatically organized in the way Newton famously hoped for. Both ideas are fantasies. These days, the disunity of the sciences should be a commonplace. Why then think that in the apparently less developed domain of moral inquiry, there's an analog of the physicist's pipe dream? A century ago, Dewey recognized the point. Rigid moral codes that attempt to lay down definite injunctions and prohibitions for every occasion in life turn out, in fact, loose and slack. Stretch 10 commandments or any other number as far as you will by ingenious exegesis, yet acts unprovided for by them will occur. No elaboration of statute law can forestall variant cases and the need for interpretation ad hoc. That's from Human Nature and Conduct. The last sentence connects the moral case with the actual practices of the law. Real-life versions of Kant's lawgivers are and always will be in the position of amending, that is, not only extending, but revising the legal corpus they inherit in an attempt to improve it. But what exactly can improvement mean here? Not increasing proximity to some fixed final goal, the complete system of the law, the final moral theory, whether or not it is based on a single overarching principle. We must abandon the thought of moral or legal progress as teleological. That doesn't mean jettisoning the concept of progress in application to these domains, for there are plenty of progressive enterprises whose advances are not to be measured in terms of approaching a goal. Young musicians make progress, so does smartphone technology. In neither instance is there some perfect form approximated more closely at later stages. Progress in such cases is pragmatic. It is made by overcoming limitations and solving problems. So too for morality and for the law. Let's take stock. With respect to each of the three questions, the identity question, the autonomy question, and the foundations question, I want to liberate the third version of the categorical imperative from Kant's radically otherworldly idealizations. The Kantian Reich is a democracy in which there can be no dictator, and a fortiori, it cannot be that any of the citizens can serve equally well in the dictatorial role. Kant's notion of autonomy gives way to a degreed concept, fostered by attempts to realize a particular form of fellow citizenship, one based on delicate attention to individual propensities and individual differences. This form of interaction lies at the core of the inchoate and partial methodology emerging from efforts to systematize historical moral advances, a theme that will occupy us shortly. The task of the lawmakers is not to construct a complete system, the final code of laws, but to amend what has been passed down to them through solving the problems arising in their situation. Rawls, I suggest, remains faithful to the Kantian assumptions. He's correct to view himself as renewing Kant's own project. His answers to all three questions are at least close to those Kant adopted. I'll leave it to scholars to determine if they're identical. On one reading, Scanlon too figures as an orthodox Kantian, at least as far as the identity question and the foundations question are concerned. Any of us qualifies to be sole ruler in the Kantian Reich, so long as we conform to the demands of reasonableness. Since the moral truths are those we could reasonably defend to one another, there's a criterion for testing any proposed moral prescription, and thus for building up morality from scratch. If we interpret Scanlon in this way, he offers an alternative procedure. Instead of viewing practical reason as applying maximin under conditions of partial ignorance, he proposes that there are abstract standards for reasonableness in defending particular moral claims to others. The quarrel between Scanlon and Rawls remains within the Kantian family. Yet in recognizing the existence of others to which a reasonable decision maker might be responsible, Scanlon links his account to actual processes of deliberation. To be sure, he doesn't think it necessary to look at the details of historical or contemporary discussions. Reasonably enough, by his own lights, since an abstract, context-independent notion of reason and of reasonableness determines the structure of any proper deliberation. In that assumption, I trace the residues of supernaturalist fantasy. Naturalists like me want to scrub those away. Let's see what can be made of Kant's third formulation when the cleansing is done. Why do we have moral philosophy at all? Many contemporary philosophers, including some as distinguished and insightful as Nagel and Scanlon, often write as if the subject arises as a matter of purely intellectual interest. We think that moral claims, some of them at any rate, have truth values. But how exactly can that be? Are there moral facts, a moral reality analogous to the physical reality natural scientists describe? On this account, the heart of moral philosophy is metaethics. Not only am I no Kant scholar, I'm not a scholar at all, but I'll venture a historical conjecture. For most of the history of philosophy, thinkers turned to morality because they hoped to improve the societies they knew and the conduct of the citizens who lived in them. Plato and Aristotle, Hume and Smith, Kant, Bentham and Mill all wanted to show the world how human lives and human actions could be better than they currently were. Call this the Reformist Impulse. Now, the Reformist Impulse might easily generate meta-ethical questions as derivative issues. You discover you can't find your way to the moral truths, or you can't defend your conviction that the moral truths are what you have found and advertised unless you offer an abstract account of moral truth. The intellectual interest stems from a practical problem. You must know what moral correctness is before you can locate it and defend it to doubters. I suspect that's why there's so much meta-ethics about these days and why debates about moral realism rage so fiercely. Yet for people moved by the reformist impulse, the turn to meta-ethics is a cheat and a disappointment. For the answers offered to the meta-ethical question seem to provide no guidance to the aspiring reformer. Zero. Not only are they too vague to help with the urgent moral questions of the day, but they don't seem to explain the successes and failures of the past. Ironically, philosophers who provide subtle answers to the meta-ethical issues often make major contributions to the burning moral issues that arise. Nagel and Scanlon are shining instances of this phenomenon, but their normative insights are completely detached from their meta-ethical convictions. The ascent to the meta level doesn't generate what the reformist impulse hoped for. I suggest we come back down again and start over. Reformers want to improve individual behavior and social arrangements. Their emphases may fall in different places, but it's useful to recognize two connected levels. Moral progress can be made by individual people and by whole societies. Sometimes in the past, moral progress has occurred, and as we investigate the cases, it becomes evident that it's typically chancy and bloody. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of opportunities for women, the acceptance of same-sex love, all these long and complex processes could easily have gone very differently. After the dust has settled, it's easy to exclaim, how could people ever have thought that? But as any good history reveals, people who seem to themselves and to those around them eminently reasonable, virtuous and decent, morally distinguished even, did think like that. Reformers want to address Dewey's question. How can we make moral progress more sure-footed and systematic? History will move them to add, how can we expose our own blind spots? That addition easily poses a trap. We tend to think of progress as teleological in all cases, and hence in this one, there's a goal, discovery of moral truth, either about some issue or as a complete system. Progress consists in making the discovery. Don't we then need to understand the character of moral truth? Mustn't we climb back on the meta-ethical carousel? No. We should conceive moral progress as pragmatic progress. It consists in identifying moral problems and in overcoming them, typically only partially. What we need then is a methodology for moral inquiry. Think of methods in the domains in which they've been most widely developed and specified, the natural sciences. These have emerged from tentative initial suggestions put to work in particular investigations and constantly refined in light of successes and failures. It's been a virtuous spiral. First ideas lead to successes, leading to second ideas, leading to more successes, leading to third ideas, and so it goes on. The task is to start an analogous process with respect to moral inquiry. This is where Kant's Reich makes its entrance. For the Kantian conception of people making laws for one another, amended to insist that they make laws together, is an obvious way to think about morality as a historical phenomenon in which progress occasionally and messily occurs. After all, that seems to be what goes on in the law itself. Locke once told a plausible story about the origins of legal institutions. Prior to the invention of courts, trials, and juries, disputes were settled violently. People who saw themselves as being harmed recruited allies and tried to extract compensation or take revenge on the perceived offenders. The law may be imperfect through corruption or ignorance or delays, But the outcomes it tends to deliver were, from the very beginning, an improvement on the frontier justice that came before. Moreover, during its evolution, there are further advances. Torture is no longer favored as an officially approved way to secure confessions. Well, unless you're a black person in the United States, I suppose. Forensic science issues more reliable methods for judging guilt. Punishment becomes less savage, and there are fewer attempts at rehabilitation. I want to construct a parallel perspective for moral practice. In a world dominated by frontier morality, Frederick Douglass was undoubtedly correct to claim that without struggle, there's no progress. Societies and individuals can try to make Douglass's famous remark obsolete by developing methods for collective moral inquiry and by embedding them in supportive institutions. So we should begin by considering how the lawmakers in the Kantian Reich should go about their business. My methodological naturalism recommends drawing an initial account of moral methodology by considering historical episodes in which moral progress appears to have been made and contrasting them with instances in which such progress has been blocked. I'll start, and that's all I'll talk about today, with the short-term history, with the kinds of changes for which there are records, enabling contemporary people to identify the actions and attitudes of the agents involved. My paradigms here are the abolition of chattel slavery in the New World, the expansion of opportunities for women from the late 18th century to the present, and the increasing acceptance of loving relations between members of the same sex, the last a welcome development I have witnessed in my lifetime. Through tracing the sequence of small changes that promoted the eventual outcome, as well as recognizing the ways in which those changes were resisted, we can hope to discover how the protracted, messy, and highly contingent route to progress might become more direct, less costly, and more reliable. One obvious feature of all three cases is a failure to listen to or to take seriously the perspectives of particular kinds of people. William James once claimed with unwarranted optimism that moral philosophers would be saved from error by the cries of the wounded. History reveals how often those cries go unheard. Also how sometimes the wounded don't even cry. I see these two aspects of the three paradigms as providing a useful opening for thinking about moral method. The first, the obvious feature, consists in a habit of exclusion. Certain kinds of complaints about the moral status quo go unheard. The second consists in the absorption by members of the excluded group of the perspective adopted by those who exclude them. Slaves acquiesce in their inferior status. Women are content to see themselves as guardians of hearth and home. Gays and lesbians regret their own depraved tendencies. Moral method can start by thinking about how to reflect on habits of exclusion and how to uncover the type of false consciousness that blinds the oppressed to their own state. How should Kantian lawmakers respond to the danger that their Reich continues to be pervaded by these features? Through developing the concept of fellow citizenship I introduced earlier, it should contain institutions for cultivating exchanges among citizens in which delicate listening is promoted, both through the social means of creating a forum in which complaints are heard and through fostering in individuals capacities for deep engagement with the perspectives of others. Furthermore, it will need a place for probing the existing ways in which particular kinds of self-conceptions are taken to be inappropriate for particular types of people. In forthcoming work, the two books to which David referred, I've tried to elaborate this approach in some detail. Here I'll only offer a brief précis. Expressions of suffering deserve to be taken seriously. Just as the law lacks the resources to hear all cases, initial decisions must rank complaints in terms of their urgency. The prime candidates for investigation are those which, if justified and if addressed, would bring the greatest relief. The second stage must explore whether those who feel oppressed by some current element of the moral code are warranted in doing so. If that inquiry concludes in their favor, the third and final phase must seek a remedy. All three segments of the inquiry are guided by the suggested concept of fellow citizenship. Specifically, decisions ideally result from deliberations meeting three conditions. First, they should include representatives of all the perspectives found among people affected by the focal issue. Second, they should make use of information well supported by the available evidence and never dogmatically appeal to premises whose credentials are matters of debate. No conversation stoppers. Third, the participants are committed to mutual engagement with one another. They listen and attempt to enter into one another's perspectives, always searching for an outcome that all can tolerate. Recall my less obvious reading of the Kantian concept of agreement on laws. The conversational ideal just outlined is best seen, as in my view ideals always are, as a diagnostic tool for exposing flaws in the existing state of affairs and marking out a direction in which improvements could be sought. My Deweyan aim is to make moral progress more systematic and sure-footed than it's historically been. When the proposed ideal is set against my three paradigms, the contrast is plain. The actual history is permeated by failures to include all the affected parties, by unsupported assumptions accepted without question, and above all, by an almost complete lack of efforts to engage with rival perspectives. Major agents of progressive change are the few heroic figures who are relatively free from these defects. Hence, I view the ideal as grounding an appropriate first step in moral methodology. By itself, however, it's insufficient. For in each of the instances, some members of the class registering the initial complaint don't raise their voices in protest. In consequence, the champions of the status quo are able to portray the vocal plaintiffs as perverse. That reaction is especially evident in the debate over expanded opportunities for women, where the few who campaign for change can be dismissed as monstrous, as incomplete half-women bent on betraying their sex. Hence, a serious deliberation, sparked by some group's challenge to an existing part of the moral code, should always consider the possibility that the apparently contented members of the group suffer from false consciousness. The obvious way of pursuing this issue is to create a permanent process in which ideals of the self, the kinds of conception through which people orient themselves and work out what is most central to their lives, are scrutinized. In particular, assumptions about the distribution of such ideals and the everyday law about how particular ideals are suited to some but not to others must be collectively investigated. As in the case of exclusion, the investigation should guard against failures of inclusiveness, unwarranted factual assumptions, and against unwillingness to enter into the perspectives of those who think differently. Articulating the concept of fellow citizenship in the way I've suggested represents an enrichment of democracy. Indeed, I'm inclined to think of it as a necessary ingredient in addressing the familiar ills evident in many contemporary democratic regimes. Consciousness of those defects, and specifically of the polarization of electorates, may quite reasonably induce skepticism about the fruitfulness of any attempts to cultivate multi-perspectival conversations. The scant empirical evidence offers some reasons for optimism. In a few places, with respect to a small number of issues, deliberations of the envisaged form prove successful. Explicit public norms expressing the elements of fellow citizenship can be expected to modify behavior. Even the most exuberant and the rowdiest folk can amend their normal ways at weddings and funerals. I want to go further, however. An educational program tied to inculcating norms for joint deliberation can prepare adults who are better able to engage with the viewpoints of others. Progressively harder challenges posed by ever more diverse groups can be a part of development through childhood and adolescence, and recurrently through later life. Not only would this program help in the collective work I've envisaged, it would also instill and refine the sensitivities required as individuals without the ability to call up at their bidding a representative council of deliberators try to simulate the proceedings in which that council would engage. Now, if I had more time, I would go on and I would talk about the long history of morality, which goes back to the later Paleolithic. But I don't have time for that. But it seems to me the same method has been at work for tens of thousands of years. Now, I'll close by anticipating an obvious objection. I've abandoned so much of the distinctive machinery of Kantian moral philosophy, you might say it's entirely false advertising to suggest that I'm doing anything Kantian at all. And I want to reply to that. It's a very plausible charge. Now, I think the third formulation of the categorical imperative does break with the rampant individualism of modern philosophy, the focus on the detached individual subject bequeathed by Descartes to his successors, up to and including Kant. Perhaps Kant was influenced by Rousseau and by Adam Smith in locating the moral agent in a community. Once the abstract notion of reason appears on the scene, however, it requires only a single subject to serve as its vehicle. Social or political relations to others become otiose. Morality flows from what historically and socially detached principles of practical rationality demand, and we're left with Kant's ideally autonomous rational being, or Rawls's decision maker, or Scanlon's paragon of reasonableness. In consequence, the third formulation adds nothing to the two that precede it. The socio-political element it appeared to introduce makes no contribution. If we continue to think in terms of three formulations, the last one is an afterthought, an occasion for Kant to articulate themes sounded earlier in the groundwork. No wonder, then, that scholars concentrate on interpreting the formula of universal law and the principle of humanity. The ugly duckling turns out to grow into an entirely unprepossessing duck. If, on the other hand, you take the introduction of a socio-political entity seriously, that must be because there are morally significant differences among its members. No single member of the Kantian Reich can stand for all. For that to be the case, their powers of reason and reasoning cannot override the variation among them. We're forced to dismantle large parts of the transcendental machinery to concentrate on human diversity, on practical attempts to resolve conflicts and to negotiate. I don't claim that taking these steps, taking the third formulation seriously, will inevitably lead to the position I've outlined. But I don't see how to move in that direction while retaining the central Kantian notions, transcendent reason, perfect autonomy, and so forth. Those I've had to jettison. So, to conclude, perhaps I've committed an especially brutish form of the genre I described at the outset, cavalierly sacrificing central elements in Kant's thought to construct an uncomprehending conversation with a great philosopher. Surely there's a danger of that. Towards the end of his Grundlagen der Arithmetik, Frege remarks that he has, quote, no wish to incur the reproach of picking petty quarrels with a genius to whom we must all look up with grateful awe. Neither do I. Kant is arguably the greatest figure in the history of Western philosophy, in part because lesser thinkers, people who diverge from him in many crucial points, are still able to find so much inspiration in his ideas. Thank you.